Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
How's everyone feeling today? I know that's a major question. We don't have a whole lot of time, but you can come see us later and talk about it. You know, that's one of the things that we do. We welcome everyone in the library, and if you have a story to tell, we like to hear it as well. But I am Mulaney Townsend Diggs, the South Area Director of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. I'm very elated to welcome you to our first indoor adult program in over 2 years. Can you believe it? Yes, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Although the library was present in the community through our outreach to our customers, from the giving of PPE to food and coats, COVID-19 testing and kits and masks, to the outdoor story times and virtual events that could be viewed by many who are even outside the borders of Prince George's County. But today, May 21st, 2022, is very significant for the Oxon Hill branch and the Prince George's County Library System, because we are here together in one location. And we are recording this presentation, as you see, of an impactful part of history that will be available for many to view later. Perhaps few have heard of Thomas Juricks, but that will change once Pat and Karen are finished today. But I'm sure that many are aware that racial terror lynchings have occurred in our past and present history. In fact, as we were planning for this program, Actor Mary Craft, diligent member of the PGCLMP, who came into the branch to drop off resources that you are receiving today in February, the historic passing of the Emmett Till anti-lynching law was announced. After 122 years of effort. Can you imagine that? Indeed, learning about our past is something that can be done within the open space of the library. And what extends that learning is having these opportunities to have presentations like this one today that will challenge us to understand the importance of our future when these racial terror lynchings appear in other forms in our communities, such as hate crimes and cases of racially motivated violent extremism like we experienced last week in Buffalo, New York. Now, get ready to be informed and challenged, and I'll pass it to you, Pat.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you, Ms. Diggs. I'm Pat Neal, and I'm one of the members of the Prince George's County Lynch Memorial Planning Committee, the Education Committee, and Karen Shrivo is the other presenter. And today we're here to give you some facts about something that happened in the community many years ago that we need to be aware of, and try to get you involved in spreading the word to others who may not know about some historical facts that occurred in your community. This event should go to about noon. We have about a 35-minute presentation. The members of the PGCLMP are available in the back at the table. They have handouts if you have questions. We've given you 3x5 cards that you can write your questions on. We will have a question and answer period at the end, so you can save until then. If you don't want to, you can leave it on the table in the back, or if you have comments you want to make, please make sure you write them on the 3x5 card and leave it at the table in the back. But we will have a time for discussion at the end. I'd like to make sure I ask you to silence your phones this time so we don't have those disruptions if you put it on vibrate. And I hope that all of you signed in, because we'd like to keep you informed. The Prince George's County Lynch Memorial Committee meets every month, the third Saturday from 2 to 4. And we have virtual meetings, so you'll be able to attend that. We had one today, actually. If there are any elected officials here, if you want to raise your hand, introduce yourself. Do we have anyone who's an elected official? Okay, we did invite our legislators to come so they can learn also. Okay, Karen Shrivo is, at this time, is going to give you a brief overview of the Prince George's County Lynch Memorial Committee, and then we will continue with the presentation.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for a presentation of the untold story of the lynching of Mr. Thomas Juricks in 1869. It took place in Piscataway, which is in Prince George's County, Maryland. This presentation, as you may know, is co-sponsored by the Prince George's County Memorial Library System and the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project, or PGCLMP for short. I'm a member of PGCLMP. You'll hear more about our organization in a bit. But first, were you aware that a black man, Mr. Thomas Juricks, was lynched in Piscataway in 1869? Likely not. As with many racial terror lynchings, these incidents were not shared historically. This presentation tells Mr. Juricks' tragic story. It is a painful story to tell, and it is a painful story to hear. And it's a painful part of our country and our county's history that we must acknowledge and come to terms with. We seek to tell this story not to lay blame or shame on any person or group. We seek to tell his story because we believe that healing our divisions cannot happen without a fearless acknowledgement of the past. This presentation also explains the necessity to tell this buried story from our past while learning about the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project and how you can get involved in our work around truth, reconciliation, and healing. But before we delve into this local history, we'd like to tell you a little bit about ourselves. The Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project is a diverse, volunteer grassroots organization that was formed in 2019. We are an inclusive organization that works to advance the cause of reconciliation in our county by documenting the history of racial terror lynchings and advocating for public acknowledgments of these murders. We are a group of community activists, clergy, educators, historians, politicians, and others working towards racial justice and reconciliation. My colleague Pat is a retired educator, a member of PGCLMP's Education Committee, and a member of the DC and Prince George's County Historical Societies. I'm a member of the PGCLMP Outreach Committee, and I'm a Unitarian Universalist community minister involved in justice issues. PGCLMP collaborates with other organizations to advance the cause of racial justice. Some of our partners are on this slide. Before we continue, let's define what we mean by racial terror lynching. To answer that, we'd like to share a short video featuring Brian Stevenson, you may know is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, one of our partner organizations. We'll show the video now.
People hear the word lynching, they think it means a hanging, but that's not what we're talking about. Racial terror lynchings are violence, lethal violence directed at people because of their race in an effort to terrorize the entire community. Racial terror lynching is a particular kind of violence that emerges as Reconstruction collapses following the Civil War. People in the South did not believe that enslaved people, black people, were equal. They thought they were less than human. They were subordinate, less than deserving of the rights that the new Constitution provided them. And so they began to use violence to create a system of racial hierarchy. The crimes, if you will, that black people could be accused of were often not crimes at all. Passing a note to a white woman, not stepping off the sidewalk, laughing, not calling a white person sir or mister. These social transgressions got many African Americans killed. This violence was not directed just at the person who was murdered. It was directed at the entire African American community. It was terrorism. And for us to recover from that violence, from that terrorism, we all have to know it, and we have to deal with it, we have to address it, we have to talk about it.
Maryland has over 40 documented racial terror lynchings. In our own Prince George's County, 4 black men were murdered by lynching, and no one was held accountable. We call their names, which you can see on the screen. Thomas Juricks, John Henry Scott, Michael Green, and Stephen Williams. We say their names to acknowledge their humanity and to make them seen. PGCLMP plans to honor and memorialize all 4 victims of racial terror in Prince George's County. Some may ask, what good can come from talking about lynchings? That's a fair question. Why do we want to talk now about events that took place in the past? To answer those questions and to provide some context for our presentation, we'd like to show another short video featuring EJI's Brian Stevens.
It's easy to fear a history that's not pretty, that's not perfect, that's not all good. It takes a little bit of courage to tell the truth in any setting, but when it's done right, there's something so much better on the other side of it than holding in that lie. We've been holding in a lie about our history for a long time. I think it's time to speak the truth about it. And I actually believe that we can get to someplace much, much better than we've been in America when it comes to racial justice, when it comes to an identity that we can all be proud of. But it's going to take a little bit of courage. And so be willing to do something that's a little bit uncomfortable in the hope that you'll get someplace that's a lot more liberating.
Now that you have a better understanding of racial terror lynching, we're ready to tell the story of Thomas Juricks. Pat will share his story with us.
The story of Thomas Juricks. As you can see in the photo, this was a field trip that the committee took to show the actual location in Fort Washington where Thomas Juricks may have lived. Today's presentation recounts our country's painful history of racial terror through the story of Thomas Juricks, who was lynched in Piscataway in 1869. We'll start by telling you about the man, Thomas Juricks. Then we'll provide a brief description of the place and times for context before finally getting context of his tragic murder. So who was Thomas Juricks? He was born a black man in in Frederick County, Maryland. The date is unknown. He was a freedman who eventually moved to Prince George's County, Maryland, in an area which we now call Fort Washington. He was a husband and a father. Thomas and his wife Barbara had 6 children: Milton, Abbs, John, Mary, Ella, Henry, and Jane. The Juricks family lived on the property of Mr. Thomas Adams, and the Juricks home was roughly located at today's location of Adams and Jackson Drive, as you see listed, which is now the crossroads of a quiet suburban street in Fort Washington. If you go there today, to the intersection of Adams Drive and Jackson Drive, that's approximately the location of where Thomas Juricks lived. In 1869, Mr. Juricks worked as a laborer at a nearby show farm. The show farm was located near the intersection of Livingston Road and Oak Fork Road. Today, as shown in this photo, there is a food zone convenience store in that location at the intersection. The events that we are about to describe occurred in or right outside of Chapel Hill, which was the Black community at that time in the area. Piscataway was the larger officially recognized town in the area, which is why we refer to Piscataway in our story of the telling of Thomas Juricks. Chapel Hill was a post-Civil War Black farming community. It began with the establishment of Freemansboro School in 1868, a Methodist church or Methodist meeting house they called it at that time. And according to the 1830 census, the settlement and land ownership consisted of free Black people. The names you see on the map refer to some of the plantations that were there before the Civil War. So you hear more about the Edelman, the Townsend, the Hatton later on. In 1868, Albert Owen Shorter, a freeman, purchased land from the Hattons and built a home in Chapel Hill. Mr. Shorter was a community man, and he was a leader who helped establish the Chapel Hill School, the Grace Methodist Church, and the descendants of the Shorter family still reside to this day in the Fort Washington area. In October 1868, the Johnsonville School was built with materials and aid from the Bureau of Freedmen's Refugees. The school was presumably named after Charles Johnson, an active trustee of the school during Reconstruction. By the 1880s, several families of free Black people and freemen began to settle and establish small farms on tracts of land that were purchased from former plantation owners. By 1905, several African American families, including some of the names you see on the map, such as the Hensons, the Colberts, Brooks, Hawkins, and Delaney's, had settled in Chapel Hill. Piscataway would have been the nearest center of business for Thomas Juricks and his family, and it included a post office, various stores, a hotel, several doctor offices, and a blacksmith. The main street shown on this map is now named Floral Park Road, and it's right around the corner from the present-day St. Mary's Catholic Church on Piscataway Road on Route 223. What was it like then for Mr. Juricks? In the mid-19th century, the area north of Piscataway was primarily plantations, most likely growing tobacco. The plantations were owned by a few families and worked by hundreds of enslaved people. While other parts of the state embraced abolition, Prince George's County white people were resistant to emancipation. and they voted overwhelmingly against the 1864 Maryland Constitution, which would have given emancipation to the enslaved, and it would have abolished slavery in the state of Maryland. As of 1860, Henry Hatton, one of the major landowners in the Piscataway area, still enslaved at least 25 people. John Shove, of whom Juricks worked, held at least 15 enslaved people. On October 12, 1869, that was a fateful day. Now that you have a sense of the place and times, we can begin to start telling you the story of Thomas Juricks and the lynching of Thomas Juricks. Due to contradictory newspaper reports, the exact retelling of the story is impossible. The accounts frequently conflict with or include details that do not geographically make sense to counteract this. We've drawn on other resources such as field notes from the Freedmen's Bureau and other historical accounts of patterns of lynching during this period. So we begin. A common excuse given for lynching is accusing a black man of assaulting a white woman. In this story, there was indeed a white woman, Miss Dooley. According to one account, she was traveling in Prince George's County. She was described as a beautiful, intelligent young lady who had been teaching in Prince George's County about a mile away from Fort Washington. On the morning of that fateful day, October 12, 1869, Miss Dooley was on her way to school to teach class. According to news articles and from the Baltimore Sun and the Afro-American newspaper, the Alexandria Gazette, and the Maryland State Archives, this information was identified that on that fateful morning, Miss Dooley was traveling along with an unidentified male acquaintance who gave her a buggy ride from the docks on the morning of the assault. Allegedly, she arrived at a bend on the road and she decided to get out of the buggy and travel the rest of the way to school on foot. On October 12, 1869, the assault on Miss Dooley occurred. At some point, Miss Dooley, it was described in newspaper articles that she was allegedly assaulted, robbed, and beaten unconscious. According to the news articles, her initial screams alerted a pair of nearby hunters and a fellow teacher, Mr. Eckhart. They found Miss Dooley lying in the road unconscious. They transported the incapacitated Miss Dooley to a neighboring home where she was treated by Dr. Dyer. You ask yourself, who was the unidentified male acquaintance that she was taking a ride with that morning, as the news article stated, and why did she decide to get out of the buggy and travel the rest of the way on foot? These questions were never considered when searching for the perpetrator of her assault. A rush to judgment occurred. A posse of roughly 50 local male residents was assembled to hunt down the perpetrator. The posse first apprehended a black man they found on the road named James Jackson. Soon after, they captured Thomas Juricks, who was transporting goods down the road on an ox-drawn cart. If Juricks had committed the assault, you might ask yourself, why would he stay anywhere near the scene of the crime? Well, the posse chained Juricks and Jackson together. Despite the only evidence pointing toward either man was that they were in the area at the time of the attack. And the only evidence later provided for Juricks' guilt was the presence of a homemade bandage which was a piece of cloth that he tore from his pants because he had cut his hand the day before, and he tied it around his hand. And the only other thing was the mere fact that he was in the vicinity of the assault. At that time, of course, presumption of guilt was given without a lot of evidence. Both men were taken to Justice Brooke in the Piscataway district, but without a witness or any evidence condemning them, Brooke decided to hold the two men in custody overnight and hoped that Miss Dooley would regain consciousness and be able to identify her perpetrator. Mr. Juricks was not given the presumption of innocence until proven guilty through a trial. Around midnight, a group of men attempted to lynch both Juricks and Jackson, but the guards convinced the mob to disperse and allow Brooke to find evidence to identify the perpetrator. The following morning, Miss Dooley still had not recovered, and the doctor was unsure if she would survive. It was at that time that members of the community claimed to have discovered a piece of fabric near the scene of the assault that matched Juricks' homemade bandage that he had made the day before on the farm from an injury. This was all they needed to condemn Juricks. The decision was made to transport him to Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Juricks was placed under the so-called protection of Constables John Underwood and Anthony Anderson as they set out for Prince George's County, Maryland. Knowing probably that he would be hanged, whether by posse or a judge, Juricks asked to be taken by his home to say goodbye to his family. When the wagon came to a stop at the Juricks' home, a mob of about 20 men wearing handkerchiefs over their faces with eye holes cut out set upon the wagon to kidnap Juricks. Supposedly, Constable Underwood attempted to stop the attack by firing several gunshots, but he was subdued. He was tied up and left on the side of the road. The story goes on that Constable Anderson was forced to drive the wagon out of the woods. Then he was tied up and left at the edge of the woods. Note that when we read news accounts of the incident, you have to consider the source, because who tells the story makes the difference. You have to take those accounts with a grain of salt. White-owned newspapers tend to justify these extrajudicial murders by lynching. Luckily, we have some of the black newspapers that were available. The Afro-American newspaper also told the stories of what happened to blacks during that time. In addition, there are conflicting accounts. The only thing we know for certain is that Juricks was kidnapped by a mob in front of his home and family and taken in the woods and lynched. Here are some things to consider as you think about this story. Does it make sense that the constable would do Juricks the favor of taking him by his home to say goodbye to his family? Consider that a few years prior, after slavery, it was part of the constable's job to capture enslaved people. The mobs could have kidnapped Juricks at any point along the road. Is it a coincidence that they did it right in front of his family at his home? Or was it done to intentionally traumatize the family and intimidate the community? While we will never know for sure, the history of racial terror suggests that it's a strong possibility. Going further into the woods, the mob stopped at an oak tree with a waiting noose. Juricks was forced into the noose and made to stand atop the wagon. When the wagon was moved, Juricks jumped and he caused the rope to slip from the high perch down a little lower. His feet were able to touch the ground, saving him for a brief moment. But one of the men jumped on Juricks' shoulders while the rest of the mob swung his body back and forth to strangle him. Following this, the mob arranged themselves in a firing line, and they each shot a volley of bullets into Juricks' body. Thomas Juricks was left to swing from the tree for 2 hours before a coroner was sent to cut him down and simultaneously declared him death from hanging by unknown persons. The October 16th article from the Evening Star newspaper describes the grand jury investigation of the lynching. The article illustrates the two systems of justice that we still see used today. The article also noted that the circuit court in Upper Marlboro dispatched Sheriff Dyer with orders to secure the prisoner's safe passage to jail. But safe passage was not possible after all because, and I quote, justice had already been satisfied. Justice had already been satisfied? This is certainly an odd interpretation of justice, when by satisfied, they are referring to the fact that Mr. Juricks was murdered by lynching before the sheriff was able to ensure a safe passage to jail. Mr. Juricks was presumed guilty and denied due process through the normal judicial system. And even if he was taken to jail unharmed, the likelihood of a fair trial and verdict was very slim. Learning that the prisoner had been killed, the judge addressed the grand jury saying, quote, no matter how heinous the crime, the tribunal can never sanction its punishment by violence and mobs. It becomes your duty to investigate this matter fully and fairly. End quote. But in contradiction, the judge stated, quote, it is always desirable that the law shall be allowed to take its course. The circumstances of this case justify as fully as any could the actions of the community. Now think about that for a minute. Referring to a violent mob as the community is your first clue that justice might be hard to come by, and apparently ensuring a safe passage to the jail of a suspect is merely desirable. Due process is also apparently only desirable. In any case, the judge absolves the mob, saying the circumstances of the case justify as fully as any could the extrajudicial murder of Thomas Juricks. The explanation of Juricks' extrajudicial execution by lynching and the circumstances of the case justify the action of the mob, and the fact that no one was ever brought to trial for murder illustrates a long history of non-accountability for the murder of Black people. The lack of accountability continues to this day. Even the capturing a murderer on camera does not ensure prosecution, let alone the conviction of the murderer. Taking this into consideration, it's easy to understand the creation and the roots of the Black Lives Matter movement. A quote from a woman named Diana Diaz Granados, who is a social worker and public health advocate, stated, the protests we see across the country are about more than the recent death of George Floyd, police brutality, racism, segregation, income disparity, lack of investment in poor communities, education inequality, and racial redlining. They all have contributed to poverty and poor health outcomes and have communicated for centuries that Black lives do not matter as much as white lives. This was a quote in the Birmingham Watch in June 2020. As noted previously, when we use the term racial terror lynching, to indicate that lynchings were not directed just at the person murdered, but to the entire Black community. In Mr. Juricks' case, his lynching was directed to the entire Black community of Chapel Hill. So it's no surprise that newspaper accounts report that Thomas Juricks was buried on Hatton's Hill. Hatton's Hill is a public road that leads from Broad Creek to Piscataway, and it served as a visible threat. His grave, being shown from that hill, was a visible threat and warning to the Black Chapel Hill community. The October 13th article in the Alexandria Gazette newspaper, shown on this slide, openly admits that burying Mr. Juricks on Hatton's Hill on a public road was purposeful. The sight of his grave as the community walked by was hoped to be a constant and sufficient warning to the Black community. In spite of the white supremacist violence, the growth and prosperity of the Black community in Chapel Hill did not stop. In fact, the resilient farming community grew as a collection of tight-knit families centered around two Methodist churches. The community continued to grow, building a large and additional schoolhouses and churches. In 2009, Chapel Hill was passed over as a possible Prince George's County heritage community. Interestingly, the survey recommended against a historical designation and made no mention of Thomas Juricks' lynching. His story has been and still is missing from our history books. His story has been kept in the dark and mostly invisible. We feel strongly that Mr. Juricks' story should see the light of day. We tell his story to acknowledge what happened and to honor his memory. Unfortunately, this effort to keep these lynching stories in the dark, to suppress our country's full history, continues today as state legislatures rush to limit the teaching of our racial history and its continued legacy. As noted in a news story on June 2021, Republican lawmakers in nearly half of the states have proposed legislation to limit the teaching of concepts such as racial equity and white privilege. These bills all contain similar language and goals, and deem teaching of historical racism and its impact on modern U.S. society as divisive and racist. As you see in this photo, a young girl, her name was Ruby Bridges. She was 6 years old, and she's being escorted by U.S. Marshals to school. She was the only Black girl being escorted to integrate this school. And we say if this young Black girl was old enough to go through it, then young white children are old enough to learn about it. Irony is surely did at the teaching of historical and institutional racism and its impact on modern U.S. society is considered to be divisive or racist. So the telling of these long suppressed stories, such as the lynching of Mr. Juricks, is a way for us to fight back against the continued suppression of our nation's full history. And that full story is not pretty. The lynching of Thomas Juricks was not an isolated event. The lynchings were a calculated strategy to enforce the racial hierarchy through terror. And the numbers are staggering. Nearly 6,500 racial terror lynchings have been documented in America between 1865 and 1950, And between 1854 and 1933, there were about 46 documented lynchings in the state of Maryland. These numbers represent human beings. denied justice, dignity, and ultimately their lives. Many, many more men and women were likely to have been lynched, but we don't have the records or documentation, so it's lost to history. This flag you see was put out of the NAACP office in New York City. Every time there was a lynching, they would hang this flag outside the window. Some of the lynchings were documented. How were they documented? EJI, which is the Equal Justice Initiative, has contributed to the documentation by conducting an extensive analysis of existing research from Tuskegee University. In addition, EJI reviewed local newspapers, historical archives, and court records. They conducted interviews with local historians, survivors, and victims' descendants, and they exhaustively examined published reports in African American newspapers. Also, people like Ida B. Wells Barnett documented them as they were happening. She would write stories about it. Ms. Wells was an American investigative journalist, educator, and activist in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. She began investigating mob violence and documented lynchings throughout the South. She would travel and get the stories. And she published her research in a pamphlet you might not have heard of. Her pamphlet was entitled Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in All Its Phases. In 1892, she published this pamphlet. The Red Record was also published, was the first documented statistical report on lynching. EJI's Lynching in America report in the third edition has documented 4,084 racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and 1960. They have also documented more than 300 racial terror lynchings in other states during the same time period. And EJI has a new report out called Reconstruction in America, and it recounts the racial violence after the Civil War from 1865 to 1876. It documents nearly 2,000 more confirmed racial lynchings in other states, and the racial terror lynchings of Black people by white mobs in America than it was previously detailed. We want to thank you for bearing witness to Mr. Juricks' story. We have about 10 more minutes in our presentation to give you a little more information about Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Committee's work. But before we do that, we just want you to take a few moments to pause and reflect on this story. Perhaps during this time, you can use your note cards to write down any comments you'd like to leave with us or some of your questions. Maya Angelou wrote, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." Thank you for taking a few moments to reflect individually. We have been taught not to talk about our difficult history, so we don't have practice in reflecting on it, and it can feel uncomfortable. We recognize we've given you a lot to take in today, all at once, and that's why we provide some materials on the back table that you can take home and read at your own pace. The book on lynching that EJI has documented gives you some information on their documentation of lynchings throughout the South and other information on lynching and resources. So make sure you pick up a copy if you didn't pick up one when you came in. We hope that you have signed in so that we can keep in touch with you and send you information when we have different webinars on different topics. We had webinars on the books on the table, how the word was passed by Clint Smith, and we had one on the courthouse lawn by Sherilyn Eiffel. And we will continue to have book talks every year, and we have meetings every month, and we invite you to come and be a part of it. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague Karen, who's going to give you a couple more information facts on the Prince George's County Memorial Project. And before I do that, I do want to recognize someone who's here today from the community. Mrs. Dora Proctor, could you raise your hand and stand? Ms. Dora Proctor.
I'm only standing so you guys can see my shirt. This is the picture of the school that was built next to the church in Chapel. I am president of Chapel Hill Citizens Association, and the community does still exist. It's not the same. There are a lot of housing developments coming in and whatnot, but we do still exist. And Grace is still alive. And Grace United Methodist Church is the church.
And she's the president of the Chapel Hill Civic Association.
Right, she's the president of the Chapel Hill Civic Association. We welcome your participation and hope to get the members to work with us. And Karen's going to tell us some other information about how we can work together, and then we'll entertain a question and answer period or a short discussion if you want.
Yes, that story is a lot to take in. In the remainder of our presentation, we'll tell you a little bit more about PGCLMP, our mission, our work, and why we feel our work is necessary, and tell you a little bit about how you can get involved in this important work. First, who is the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project? Some of our members are shown in this slide, taken during a trip to explore the sites in Piscataway that are related to the lynching of Thomas Juricks. Our organization has over 240 residents from across Prince George's County. Our membership, as I mentioned, includes clergy, politicians, community activists, educators, historians, genealogists, and commissioners from the state's Maryland Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission, and people who are simply interested in working towards racial justice and reconciliation. What is our mission? You can see our mission on the slide. The Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project seeks to educate the public on the truths of our nation's continuing legacy about the institution of slavery and its impact on enslaved persons and their descendants. Memorialize victims of racial terror lynchings in our county, and to advance the cause of racial justice and reconciliation through mutual support and collaboration. Why is our work important? Consider the impact of our skewed telling of our nation's history. A 2009 survey to designate Chapel Hill a heritage community made no mention of the lynching of Thomas Juricks. This is not surprising. As noted in EJI's Lynching in America report, there is, quote, an astonishing absence of any effort to acknowledge, discuss, or address lynching, end quote. Yet, many of the communities where lynchings took place have gone to great lengths to erect markers and monuments that memorialize the Civil War and the Confederacy. We hope that you will join in PGCLMP's efforts to help Prince George's County confront and recover from our own local history of racial violence. So, how do we confront and recover from our tragic history? How do we begin to heal? We begin with acknowledgement. Our nation has truly never acknowledged our violent past, and the lynching perpetrators have never been held accountable. A powerful EJI video, which we'll show in a minute, speaks to the need to acknowledge racial injustice and the importance of telling the whole story about our past. This video is less than 2 minutes. Let's watch it.
So today, we want to honor all the people in the community who have been witness to suffering and inequality and injustice by unveiling this marker, which we're delighted to present and to have stand here in this very sacred location.
It was powerful because in order to move on in the future, we need to reflect on past, and we can't just ignore it. We need to fix it. We need to discuss this. It's just, I have no words.
And places throughout the South, what they've done is, instead of acknowledging that, they will tell part of the story and not tell the whole story. And the whole story needs to be told. And I think these markers connects that history. Because we're not gonna be able to move forward until we do that.
I hope the video gave you a sense of how profoundly moving and healing acknowledgement and memorization can be. The PGCLMP seeks to confront Prince George's County history of racial violence by collaborating with communities to memorialize victims of racial terror lynching through a variety of community remembrance projects, such as soil collection ceremonies at the site of lynchings, historical marker placements, racial justice essay contests for students, and other community engagement programs like this presentation. Through programs such as these, we hope to foster honest, truth-filled, meaningful dialogue about the past and present racism and work to racial justice today. What is exactly a soil collection ceremony? These powerful, moving ceremonies involve digging up soil at the site of lynchings and preserving it in a glass containers with the person's name etched on it. Many communities across the country have already held soil collection ceremonies, including neighboring Montgomery and Anne Arundel counties. The Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project seeks to hold community-led soil collection ceremonies for the people who were lynched in Prince George's County. These ceremonies provide, quote, a tangible way for community members to confront the legacy of racial terror lynching and to memorialize African Americans, quote, end quote, who were lynched. The slide shows jars of soil from soil collection ceremonies and are now in display at the EJI Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And the quote, which is on the bottom, which you may not be able to see from the back, and regardless, is a moving one, from Brian Stevenson, Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He says, and I quote, "In this soil, there is the sweat of the enslaved. In this soil, there is the blood of victims of racial violence and lynching. There are tears in the soil from all those who labored under the indignation and humiliation of segregation. But in this soil, there is also the opportunity for new life, a chance to grow something hopeful and healing in the future," end quote. How can you get involved? One of PGCLMP's projects, currently in the initial planning stage, is to memorialize the first known lynching in our county, that of Mr. Thomas Juricks. We hope to work with the community to plan and hold a soil collection ceremony at the site of Mr. Juricks' lynching this fall. How can the community get involved? In collaboration with the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Committee, PGCLMP will be conducting oral histories from descendants of victims and perpetrators of racial terror lynchings. We need the community's help to help find the descendants. We've learned the names of families that lived in the area at the time of the lynching or within a generation of it. If you recognize any name shown on the slide and can help us contact their descendants, we'd be grateful. Or if you know other families alive at the time that have descendants that we could contact, we'd appreciate your help. And the names are from the plantation owner families: Hatton, Edelman, Thorne, and Graham. Chapel Hill families: Albert Owen Shorter, Charles Johnson, the Hensons, Colberts, Brooks, Hawkins, and Delaney's. We are hopeful that community members and organizations will join us in further research, including tapping into local community and family knowledge, especially regarding descendants who lived in Piscataway in 1869, to help give us the fullest and most accurate picture possible of the lynching of Thomas Juricks. And how can you contact us? The codes are back in the back as well by the table where you signed in, so you can scan those to find out how to contact us. And so you can also indicate on the sign-in sheet at the back of the room if you'd like to be involved in the planning of the soil collection ceremony, or if you have information about descendants. And to be added to our listserv to learn about upcoming meetings and events, please email us or submit your information on the Contact Us page of our website. You can also check out our website to learn of other ways in which you can get involved. And of course, we encourage you to take the materials available at the back of the room. And please help us spread the word about the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project. We truly appreciate the time and the interest. Thank you so much for coming. We hope that you're inspired to support us in this healing and necessary work. That concludes our formal presentation. I'll turn it over back to my colleague, Pat.
Other questions?
Yes, I'm gonna take questions. And before I take questions, I just want to thank the Prince George's County Memorial Lynching Memorial Library System for hosting us, and for the Oxon Hill branch of hosting this workshop today. And we want to thank anyone who has come out. Do we have any elected officials or anyone from the press here? We always want to recognize our printed press because that's how the word gets spread. Okay, at this time, we're going to, yes.
We do have an organization.
Okay, any organizations that are here?
Affiliated with the Freedmen's Bureau.
Okay, if they would like to stand up, any organizations from the community who are here?
We're here.
If you would like to come and say something for a moment?
Can I take this down? Yes. Thank you. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to speak, but this gives us an opportunity to do so since we are discussing the lineage here as it relates to the American freedmen. So first I want to introduce myself. Excuse me. My name is Hassan Powell, and I am one of the advisory board members of a local organization here called Capital Accountability Project. Capital Accountability Project is a political task force. We are a nonprofit organization. Our primary focus and only focus is on the American freedmen here in the state of Maryland. Currently, we have put forth legislation requesting that the state of Maryland reinstitute the Office of Freedmen Affairs. We are on a national level as well. We have currently over 30 different organizations within us that we work with. We are working on not only the Office of Freedmen Affairs here, we've also put forth a proclamation to the state of Maryland asking for the month of November to be designated as American Freedmen Month, given that we were emancipated here November 1st, 1864. In addition to that, we have also put forth a request that they now disaggregate the data and give us specificity as it relates to what our lineage is. We are no longer embracing the flattening terminology such as African American, Black, and so forth. We are now looking at delineating how we are faring here in the state of Maryland, and therefore we are asking first that they recognize us as a specific group with a specific lineage that ties us to the state of Maryland and the harms that were rendered to that specific group. And that would be based on the historical legislation as well as the historical record, the American freedmen. That's what we were named and recognized as we came out of the Civil War and as we went through Reconstruction. Also, Abraham Lincoln acknowledged that if it wasn't for the freedmen, the American freedmen, we would not have won that Civil War. If most of you all don't know, there are approximately 3.5 million pieces of legislation on the record that was passed in behalf of the American freedmen that were never enacted. Therefore, we have taken on the task that we watch all legislation coming through the state of Maryland. And then we put forth, we actually sit down, we have a legislative writing committee, we sit down, we examine it, and then we write legislation to the disparities that we are experiencing here. There are disparity studies here in the state of Maryland that you will find absolutely disheartening when it comes to that group, which are, again, the American freedmen. Today, we are here to share our flyers. I have some here. And basically, what this flyer is on this side, it tells you why it's necessary for us to have the Office of Freedmen Affairs here in the state of Maryland. On the back, it tells you who an American freedman is. It also, what we did was because we are reaching out to our youth as well as to all the other generations, we have put on the back on some of these current American freedmen that comes from the state of Maryland, as well as one of our historical freedmen here. Again, our goal is to, as the speaker here eloquently said earlier, is to heighten the awareness of our history as it relates not just to the state of Maryland, although that is where we are based, but on a national level. We have now come to understand that with all the other groups, and for me personally, I work in Annapolis, so I'm very much aware of the legislation, so let me just say that. But all of the other groups have specific identity when it comes to who they are. It is only the American freedmen where our lineage, our contributions here, as well as our traumas here, have been erased from all the history books. Therefore, we don't know who we are. We transitioned from American freedmen to Negro, to colored, to Black, to African American, to people of color, to minorities, to BIPOC, all of these terms ultimately did exactly what they were seeking to do, which was to erase our lineage, our history, and our contributions. So we are now here to say, no, we have a specific lineage, and we embrace and we love every ethnicity. It's not about us being divisive, xenophobic, or any of that. It's about us finally saying, we have a history that absolutely should be told. We have a history that is rich. It's not just slavery. Our children, our ancestors, and our future generations have a right, one, to be made whole from the legalization of slavery, but then the crimes against humanity. Our children, our future children, and our ancestors have a right for their stories to be told. And we have a responsibility to know it, embrace it, and then be able to move forward with it. That is the only way that we can really begin true healing. So I want to thank everyone here that allowed me to take a moment to speak. I don't want to extend the program, but if anyone has any questions, you will find on our flyer, there's a scan code. Also, we have a website, it's captaskforce.org, which is also on the flyer, but if you do the scan code, it will take you there. We will be here, there are 5 of us here, well, now 4 of us here, but we are open to having any conversation. We are open to bridging any gaps with any organization that is up and willing to work with us specifically for the interest of the American freedmen. I would encourage everyone to go and pull the MBE disparity studies for the American freedmen here. And if that doesn't motivate you, along with the lynching projects information, to really get involved, to really embrace that this story, our history, our lineage, our value, our wealth, and our contribution absolutely must be told. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else from the organization? Okay. At this time, we want to proceed with questions from the floor. I have some questions that were passed to me on a card. I'll start with those if no one wants to raise one from the floor. Yes.
Is there a memorial plaque on Mr. Juricks' grave? And if not, are there plans to memorialize it?
Yes, that's one of the things we hope to do in the fall. We're trying to plan a soil collection project. EJI is the organization in in Alabama that has the museum, and they provide the plaques. We hope to put a plaque up at the site where we think he was lynched. I'm not sure if we have the information on where he's buried. If there is a memorial site, that's something we'll have to look into. I don't know if anybody on the committee knows, but we're not aware of his actual burial site at this time, but we are aware of the general area where he was lynched, so we want to put a sign there to commemorate that place.
Have you encountered any opposition in Piscataway for memorializing?
Not so far. We run into some of the community members, and we're trying to encourage them to come out and work with us and help plan the ceremony, because we would like to have the school involved. We'd like to have students read their essays. We had an essay contest just recently. We had about 7 students who competed and won awards for their essays on racial terror, lynching, and different topics around that. We also had a creative arts contest where people were able to express their thoughts in poetry and through art. And we'll be celebrating those students on Juneteenth Day at Greenbelt, near the Greenbelt Library or the Community Center, and at Watkins Park we will have a table. So we invite the community, and we will be sending you notification. That's why we use your email to let you know, to invite you to join us to help plan that ceremony for the fall, because we want it to be a community ceremony, people who live in the area to come out and say what you would like to have as a ceremony for Thomas Juricks. He's the first of 4 people in Maryland. There were 4 lynchings that we have documentation. We're sure there are more, but we only have documentation of 4 in Prince George's County. EJI has different sites, not sites, but different groups. Prince George's County has the committee, it's the Maryland Lynching Memorial Committee. And they're gonna house a lot of things at the, I think it's the Reginald Lewis Museum in Baltimore. They will start keeping things there. But we hope every state will have a committee. And from this, we're one of the local committees from the Prince George's Lynching Memorial Committee. There are other ones in the county that have done lynching and soil collection ceremonies. Rockville did one last fall in September. You might have read about it in the newspaper. They had 2 people who were lynched in Rockville, and they did a walk from the site, the church, and they did soil collection ceremony last fall. I think Annapolis has done one near the courthouse. I think Hanover is doing one. So there are different counties in Maryland. I think maybe at least 8 to 10 that might have committees like Prince George's does. So it's up to each state and each committee to get involved and to form one. So we're always looking for volunteers to come out and help us continue telling the history. Yes.
You mentioned the lynchings in Rockville, the other one. One of the lynchings was of an 18-year-old black young man, and I'm not sure if it was Gettysburg, Rockville, but it was deemed a suicide. So I wonder if you could speak to that. And how could someone lynch them? And the noose was like the hanging noose that we see.
Right.
You know, Juricks and others.
Yeah, I'm not real familiar with that. Of course, you know, it's who tells the story. And so we don't always get the facts. And so we might know it's a lynching, but someone else may say, oh, it was suicide. They really didn't, you know, it wasn't a lynching. You know, you hear things, I think it was something about a race car driver in Florida, and he found a noose in his locker, and they tried to say he put it there himself, or no one would put it there. So you get contradictions because people are not gonna tell the truth, but we know it's there. We know what the symbol of a noose means when it's put in someone's locker or in the workplace, anywhere. So we try to follow those things up, and that's why we're appreciative to the Black press. We have to keep supporting them because they tell the story. In the African American newspaper, I put some of the articles on the back table on that board. Those were published in the newspaper back in the early 1900s, and that's where you get some of the documentation of things that have happened. If some of the newspapers didn't publish the stories, we wouldn't have the information we have here today. I think the Harper's Weekly has a lot of pictures and photos of things that happened back there, but you have to research them. The Baltimore Sun did a lot of articles on lynchings. So the information's there, but no one's talking about it, and because of the fear that was put upon the community, you just don't hear people talking about lynchings. And a lot of that information was not passed down to their descendants. Grandchildren have no idea of some of the things that happened. I know my mother told me about her grandmother. My mother's 100, she's still living, and she's saying she remembers her grandmother used to sit them in a circle and tell them stories about slavery and things, but she doesn't remember them. She wished she did. Her mother was born in Hume, Virginia, so I'm not sure where her grandmother was. But we've lost that heritage because we don't have the oral storytellers anymore. So when people come around to do oral history, they're trying to get the stories from the grandchildren of what happened so that we can pass it on. Because if we don't tell our own story, it may not be told, because we are always not in charge of writing the history in the history books and what's being taught in the schools. And that's why it's important for us to be present at school board member meetings, to go to your local school to see what history is being taught, to be familiar with the curriculum that children are being taught. And you don't have to have children to be active. You can be a community member, but you want to make sure that the children today going to school are being taught their history. And you want to make sure that books are available in libraries so that you can read about your history. Because a lot of things I didn't learn until I was an adult, you know, because it wasn't taught in the school. So we have to teach ourselves, and we have to reach out and research. And that's why I'm a member of this group, because I want to know my history. And I learn something new every day. And so I'm trying to help spread the word so that we know, because I had no idea about lynchings in Maryland until I joined this group. And it's kind of hard to find the information out, because It took me a while to find this group because I just happened to see a flyer. I was a member of the Historical Society, and somebody happened to announce that the Prince George Lynchings Community Group was having meetings and was starting up. So we have to spread the word and let people know there are groups out there that are trying to spread your history and talk about what's happening. Yes.
Thank you. That was a perfect opportunity for me. I'm Jacqueline Woody, and I am president of the Prince George's County Truth Branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. It is the organization founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And that organization, of course, is the one that every year creates the theme for Black History Month. And that is certainly the mission of that organization, to tell the story, to learn the story, to disseminate information. So I encourage all of you to look at our organization and consider membership. And I did have a question also. Can I go and ask?
Sure.
Because I'm also a librarian.
Okay.
So my question was whether or not you were able to find or use some of the resources from the Prince George's County Library System to do much of the research that you've done. Our branch, the ASALA branch, Association for the Study of African American, etc., is called the Truth Branch because our roots began in this particular Oxon Hill Library where there is the Truth collection of African American history. So that's why I wondered if you had been able to get some of your information from you as a resource from here, from the library system.
Jay.
Thank you.
I don't think that we have taken advantage of the materials that are here. We have taken advantage of the Prince George's County Historical Society materials that are at the Greenbelt branch. And so thank you very much for bringing the other resources to our attention because we are always looking for new sources of information. But a number of the maps you saw on the screen, etc., they came from research that we were facilitated by the county library system.
And the new Hyattsville branch is just open, has a.
Yes, I haven't gotten a chance to get there, but I would.
Maryland, Prince George's Maryland collection. Yeah.
Right, and I'm familiar with ASALA, and I go to their events every year, and we have a lot of organizations, and through those organizations, that's how we find out about things, so we like to mention them and include them when we do things. A lot of our research did come from the Maryland archives. We have several people in the committee who work with the archives and with the Park Service, and so they've given us information. Of course, we're always looking for new resources. I had been to the Harriet Tubman room, right?
The Truth.
The Truth room, I'm sorry, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is my other favorite woman besides Harriet Tubman, but Sojourner Truth, here at Oxon Hill, you can't check out any books, right, but you can come and look and read and do research in that room, and they have any book that you want by a Black author usually is there, and some of the older ones, so it's a great place to start doing some research and to learn about history. Yes.
The school, when the school in Chapel Hill was closed, it was closed. There was the black school in Chapel Hill, the black school in Oxon Hill. Then they built Sojourner Truth Elementary School.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the old records from Chapel Hill School may have been transferred here. Because this is Sojourner, this is my elementary school.
Right.
And it was changed, that's why there is the Sojourner Truth room here. Because this was Sojourner Truth Elementary School.
So this was the site of the school?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's good to know, and we have a lot of information. Now, a lot of people forget Sojourner Truth, but Sojourner Truth did a lot for women and for women's rights, and she traveled around. She wasn't educated, she had been a slave, but she spoke out and stood up, and you heard her, and I admire her for her strength and how she traveled around, and you know, she got her name because she would travel around to different places sojourning, and she would tell the truth. And so she took that name, Sojourner Truth. Other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to know, in your research of this story specifically, the woman who was attacked, was there any evidence that she regained consciousness and spoke about events that happened that day, or was she also feared out of speaking, telling the truth?
Right. I don't know, I don't think she ever gained consciousness, but I don't have all that information. The person who did the research is sick today, so she's not able to be here, but she got it from the archives and newspaper articles, and, according to the articles, it just said, that she hadn't regained consciousness before he was lynched, so she may have come to afterwards, I don't know. There are a lot of questions surrounding it. Yes.
Hi, I also wanted to thank Asala because I remember, and that's why I'm here.
Okay.
But I went down to the Legacy Museum in Alabama, and as I understood it, there was an exhibit there that had a plaque, I think, for every county in the United States, and the names of everyone in that county who had been lynched.
Right, they're hanging from pillars from the
Yes,
ceiling.
and they were waiting for each county to come and claim their pillar to bring it back to their county. And I wanted to know if Prince George's County has done that.
Not yet. We're still trying to commemorate because they don't have our soil collections because we're just getting ready to start, because we have 4 that we know of. So when we do Thomas Juricks, hopefully in the fall, that will be the first jar that will go down there, and then they will make a pillar, or they may have the 4 people down there already. But I think until we do that, and then we have a site for it, now that the museum, the Reginald Lewis Museum may become the site, I'm not sure, but we will look into it. That's something our committee can discuss in the next year, so I'll bring that to their attention. Other questions from the floor? Yes.
Sorry, another one. You mentioned that Mr. Juricks had 6 children. Are there any descendants today that are living in the area?
Not that we know. We've been trying to find descendants. There's an oral history project going on now, and there is an oral history testimony, I think, that's gonna be in August. I'm not sure where it's gonna be, but they've been trying to find descendants of different people who've been lynched in Maryland, and I know there is gonna be some kind of hearing, and we invite the descendants, but that's one thing that we've been trying to do. We trying to find more history, someone who knows of Thomas Juricks or any of his descendants, and trying to find them is like, we just don't have the names or the information, whether names have changed, whether they moved out of the area. We only went by the newspaper articles and still trying to track them, but we haven't found any yet. So if you know of any, and even if it's not Thomas Juricks, if you know another family who has a story about someone who may be lynched in Maryland, we would appreciate that information and following up on it. I'll read some of the questions that I did get. They said, are there efforts to make Chapel Hill a part of the historical city community? And that's something I guess the Chapel Hill, community organization would probably be working on, trying to see if we could get some kind of historical designation. Is there anything done to make the history of the freedmen communities in Maryland known, like legislation? And that's something we can all do, write out Congress people and ask them, we would like to see this, to go to your local neighborhood groups, to go to the organizations that are working on these things and see if they can do it, but certainly bring it to the attention of your legislators. That's what they're there for. And so let them know that you're interested in having legislation. And they listen. The more letters you write and phone calls, you could probably get it done. Did they ever discover what happened in the Juricks case? And I don't think we have any more information on it, but that's interesting. We're still continuing to look and to research and to find more areas where we might be able to find history. One person wrote I'm not sure, as we live the event of injustice against Thomas Juricks and other victims, one is left feeling like time has stood still, and such injustices continue. The works of the PGCLMP is essential to know and let the racial history not go unrecognized in Prince George's County. We appreciate those efforts. And then I had the one about the suicide that you talked about, and we don't have the information on that. But it's important to look at those things that happen in the paper to see, could have been a lynching, and, follow up on those stories and see what happened. The detailed process of bullying and terrorizing Black community, has been very masterful, and over the years, it continues. The pamphlet by Ida B. Wells, published, I don't know where it's published. That's something I plan on researching myself, but I found it in that lynching book. If you picked up a copy, they mentioned the title. Do you have the information on it?
I found it on, Amazon when you was talking about it. I looked it up and it's right there on Amazon for like 4 books.
Okay, Amazon, 4 books. I think it's the Southern Horrors.
No, it's $4.
Oh, it's $4, okay. $4 for Southern Horrors by Ida B. Wells. And that would tell you something, because she really went around and interviewed descendants and people who've been victims of lynching. And we talked about EJI and the committees in different cities and groups. How might we connect these historical stories and facts to recent economic, racial, and social injustices occurring in our communities today? And how can we implement truth and reconciliation work? And so that's something we all think of, yes.
That would be contacting organizations. That would be contacting organizations like Capital Accountability Project. That's who we are. We work with the legislation to try to get these things out front and to our people so that they will know that this kind of stuff is here. And we appreciate your efforts to educate everyone, because we all have a part to play in this.
Absolutely.
Right.
Can I say something?
Yes.
To address how do we address some of these issues that was on that card. Currently, most of us don't know, but there is a current bill in our General Assembly called the Harriet Tubman Recovery Act. It's a reparations bill for the American freedmen. But how they have it termed is the descendants of the formerly enslaved. But that is us, the American freedmen. There are numerous bills that we are aware of, that we are working on, and that we are sharing with the legislators to get those bills right, to address the disparities and our historical traumas that we've suffered here. But again, we are a legislative team. All we do is live in legislation specifically for the American freedmen. So if anyone has an interest in assisting in that, please reach out to us, and we can further educate you and also invite you in to join in and help us out with it.
And what's the name of your group again?
It's Capital Accountability Project. You can find us at captaskforce.org. All one word, captaskforce.org.
I think there is something that you also know too. Around the time that Thomas Juricks was being lynched, there was a new freedman school that was built in Capitol Hill, and the children of newly freed people started attending the school until that lynching. And then after that lynching, there was a serious decline.
Right, yeah, we went by that site too, where the school was, and how the parents pulled their kids out. So there was a lot of terror and fear, and people just didn't talk, especially up in Salisbury, where a lot of lynchings took place. I never knew going up to the beach and going to Rehoboth how many lynchings took place and how racist that community was, and in Cape May. And now you understand some of those small towns and the sundown towns, what took place. And even today, it's like history is being reversed, because if you don't know your history, you're going to repeat it. And it's like we're starting to repeat the history because we don't know the history. So some of the things that happened, you thought would never happen again, are starting to occur. And so you have to be careful traveling by yourself, going down south in certain roads and places. And if you read the book, How the Word Was Passed, you really learn some of the history of what happened, especially in New Orleans, and the jail and the difference. And then Memorial Day is coming up. And so from now on, I will always remember the Blackfoot Cemetery in Petersburg, Virginia, where they have a celebration every Memorial Day for the Confederate soldiers. And they have a program, they put flags on their graves, and it happens every year. And it's right in Petersburg, Virginia. Across the street from that Blackfoot Cemetery is a people's cemetery where Black people were buried. And nothing happens over there. They don't have anything on their gravestones. But, the Daughters of the American Revolution, I think, were the ones who got all the money to build a lot of the Confederate statues and to commemorate them. And after the Civil War, I believe it was said that the United States really didn't take care of the bodies of the Confederate soldiers, and so the Daughters of the American Revolution raised funds and gathered those bodies and brought them all together to the Blandford Cemetery, and that's why they have their celebration every year. You can't change some people's feeling, that's their history, that's what they want to do, but it's nice to be aware of it. And the Black Lives Movement, if nothing else, did bring awareness of all the Confederate statues that we have everywhere and why are they there, and people asking to have them removed, schools having their names changed. So it's brought about an awareness and a consciousness, but we have to go further and really learn the history and what happened so it doesn't get repeated. Yes.
Sorry, I have another question. It was based off of what she was saying.
Mhm.
So when you guys are doing research, and I only learned this as I've been in university, I'm a African American history minor, and when you learn that some of the violence and terror have always happened around election time, or when a new school was being opened, or influx of Black people were moving to the communities. When you guys are doing research, are you also researching around that time? So, for example, when you heard about the Freedmen's School that was whatever year or whatever month and year that was erected, do you start searching for newspaper articles with certain language, like it may not specifically say lynching, but it may say something about an attack or something, just around that time frame to kind of help attach some of the details of some of these stories?
We have not, that's something we can bring to our Education and History Committee. We have the Historical Society, some of them do some of those research things. So we've only been in existence, I guess, for a couple of years, since 2019. So our main purpose was to focus and make the community aware of the 4 lynchings in Prince George's County. But as we find out other things, we try to spread out. We do have webinars about those events and things in the community. I think the NAACP, we just finished with 3 different webinars over the last 4 months on different topics. We had the book talks, and those are the 2 books that we have covered. One last year on the courthouse lawn, which really talked about Salisbury and the things that happened up there, and how even today it's hard to find people to talk about what happened. So it makes it difficult to get some of that history. But the more books that come out and things that we can find, that's certainly helpful. And I think, we can look and make sure those things are in the Sojourner Truth Library. If there are certain things that will help people with their research, at least we know where to go. That's one source. And I'm sure you can come and request it. They can order certain books. If we know certain things that are not in that library, we can request to have it there so other groups can come and do the research.
Yeah, we have Maryland Interlibrary Loan as well.
Okay.
That can get material from Baltimore with the State Library Resource Center is where the African American Room is, where they keep archives. Unfortunately, Prince George's County is not an archival library, and so as to have every book, it is we have popular material as well, collection. But definitely, you're welcome to go into the Sojourner Truth Room. When you're requesting, we have staff who will go in there and will show you the material that you need.
Okay, that would be helpful, and I know the Alexandria Library is a good place to do research too. They have a lot of information, because most of us were born in either Maryland, Virginia, or in DC. And the DC Library has the Washingtonian Room, which has, and I think a Black History Room, which has a lot of Black reference materials and information that you can find. And I guess the DC History Center, which is in the old Carnegie Library, they also have information on different things around the area, houses and books and schools and things. And so we have a sheet of discussion questions that you can pick from the back that you can take home to think about. But we want to thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Did you want to say any final words?
I just wanted to thank everybody. Thank you all from the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project, Pat and Jade. Mary back there, and Donna, and I forgot.
Oh, Lois.
Lois, yes, I think I saw Karen. And, thank you all for coming out today and giving us, this wonderful presentation and taking us back in history and challenging us, as I said earlier, challenging us to think on those questions that were brought up today and what we can do to, learn more and to then keep talking about it. Let the story be told, not silenced, but told. One of the things I also wanted to say is in this room, in the future, it will be a commons area called the Foundry. And one of the things we wanted to have was a digitization area where we could record stories. So if that comes to fruition, this will be a place where you can come and we would have the digital capacity to record your story. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yes.
So we
on
hope,
social media in some way for folks, I don't know if you said it's recorded, but.
it's right there. Hopefully everything, we captured everything. Hopefully if it's still going, I don't know. I don't think anybody has been to look at it. But we will send this up to our digital team and they will create it and put it on our website.
So you do have an uploaded version of your presentation and all the speakers, is that what you're saying?
I do, but I don't know what they're gonna do with it once they get it. It probably will be condensed.
They will put it directly on your website.
Once they condense it and figure out what they want to show, yes.
Right. We want to thank you all for coming out.
Okay, thank you.
And if you have more questions, feel free to come and talk to any of us at the table or up here. Thank you so much.